And I call the member for Holt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I too am pleased to speak on this private member's motion by the member for Fowler and endorse the member for Hasluck's comments with respect to us urging the Vietnamese government to honour its obligations as a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that the member for Fowler, in terms of the ongoing persecution of those that seek to exercise their rights in a democracy and should be able to do so, is raised quite powerfully in this place and other places over his period of time as a member for Fowler. It's when one seeks to be recognised, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a fully democratic nation, the actions of stymieing, stifling, quashing protests about your government or system of government lead parliaments from around the world to ask the question about that particular government. And that's a fairly serious charge to make, but unfortunately, given the number of representations that we have received collectively from all over Australia, and particularly from the very large Vietnamese diaspora that lives in our community, that makes a life in our community and has contributed so substantially to our community, it behooves us to continue to raise these ongoing abuses of human rights and seek to pressure to suggest to the Vietnamese government there's a better way forward in dealing with protest than quashing it, and dealing in the manner in which they have, particularly with the celebrated cases that have been raised, and I'll just re-emphasise briefly here. I mean, when you have 14 Vietnamese Catholics, which included the high-profile blogger Paulus Lasson, who are basically sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 13 years in what is called a subversion case, when they are merely protesting, then you've got to ask a question about the government of the country. It's also that the defendants were arrested in 2011 as a crackdown on Vietnamese youth activists who were accused of being critical of the Vietnamese government and calling for greater democracy and human rights. That does not warrant jail sentences. A number of the defendants are members of the Redemptorist group in the Roman Catholic Church, which has been engaged in community service and lobbying and talking about land seizures and corruption. To see young people young Vietnamese being condemned and sentenced to jail for carrying out protests is troubling. It's very troubling in terms of a human rights trend, and a trend that's been evident for some time in Vietnam. One case that concerns many members of the local Vietnamese community in Holt, and one that I've mentioned in this case along with the member for Fowler, is the case of Nguyen Phuong Nguyen and Dinh Nguyen Ca, who were charged under Article 88. Now, I understand that had representations from Mr Thien Dung Kiao, who is the president of the Vietnamese television on Channel 31, who came to speak to me about human rights abuse in this one in particular, and raised his concerns. Whilst Mr Thien welcomes the decision by the Appeals Court in August 2013 to free 21-year-old Nguyen Phuong Nguyen, who was serving a 6-year jail term for alleged subversion, however, Mr Thien is disappointed that Nguyen's co-defendant, 25-year-old computer technician Dinh Nguyen Ca, was not released and has only had his 8-year sentence cut in half. Again, two young people exercising their democratic right, they're in prison. The other incident that's been discussed in this place is the incident that occurred in February 2010 when Labor activists Dong Hoi Chung, Do Thi Minh Na Han and Nguyen Huang Huoc Hung were detained for organising workers at a shoe factory. And this was about basically circulating a demand for workers at a particular, and they were on strike because of their company's arbitrary payment policies and their managers' abusive behaviour. These people were put in prison. There was some question about the trial and the validity of the trial that was being conducted because they were denied a lawyer, and the Vietnamese government prevented them from speaking in their own defence during the proceedings. That is not a free and open court. In light of this particular hearing, Mr Doan and Ms Han were sentenced to 7 years prison. Mr Hung was sentenced to 9 years. What we are hearing from various representative organisations is that whilst they've been in prison, they've been subjected to deplorable treatment through their detention. In addition to prolonged periods of solitary confinement, they each have been repeatedly beaten. As a result, we understand Ms Han is now deaf in one ear, and Mr Doan has lost the use of one hand. All three suffer from rashes and liver problems, the result of poor food and sleeping conditions. Mr Deputy Speaker, that treatment is deplorable. No reasonable, responsible democratic government can undertake these actions. And I again commend the member for Fowler for raising these issues of concern, and we perhaps do have to look at the way our aid is being provided if we're providing aid to a government that treats its citizens in such a deplorable manner.